The Earthbound Immortal cards were released back in 2009 in the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG, and despite being pretty cool and very iconic as far as the 5Ds anime goes, they weren't very competitive in the TCG. That's perfectly fine, you don't have to play competitive cards if you want to play Yu-Gi-Oh! But I want to look at these cards from a competitive angle and talk about why they weren't so good. I want to mention that yes, this is only focusing on competitive TCG gameplay, so I'm aware that a couple of these cards are in Duel Links. We're not really focusing on that right now because I don't really know how good or bad they are in that version of Yu-Gi-Oh! But we do have tons of data over the past 10 years about whether or not these cards were successful, and spoiler alert, as the title would suggest, many of these cards, the vast majority of them, just haven't seen competitive play. In today's video, I'm going to read through many of their effects and talk about maybe why they weren't so good and some of the ways that Konami could have made them better. Worth mentioning is that these cards actually very recently got some support in the OCG, and we're going to be getting that support in the TCG at the end of September. I'll talk about those cards at the end of this video, but in general they don't change my analysis too much, but if you want to hear about them, stay till the end. There are 7 main Earthbound Immortal cards, and they share a lot of stuff, so all of them are dark level 10 monsters, but more so than that, the important thing here is that they all share 4 sentences of their text. I can't stress enough how big that is for an archetype, because in general, while archetypes do share similar playstyles and effect text, and even do sometimes share exact sentences, for an archetype like this to share 4 whole sentences of the exact same text is very, very strange, especially looking back at 2009 Yu-Gi-Oh! When these cards came out. That means that while we will look at different Earthbound Immortals, all of them are basically the same card outside of a few key examples. So the first line says there can only be one Earthbound Immortal monster on the field. This doesn't necessarily mean that you have to play a deck with only one Earthbound Immortal in it, but I'd say that in general, when people set out to build a deck around these cards, usually they're focusing on one playset of one of these cards because of that sort of condition where you can't just swarm the field with a bunch of them. Also, if there is no face-up field spell on the field, destroy this card. That's the second sentence that they all share, and right off the bat, you're probably wondering, hey DZ, aren't these cards very similar to the Malefic monsters? And absolutely yes. However, these cards did predate the Malefics by a few years, but yes, there are some definite comparisons to be made between the two archetypes because they share basically the same first 2 lines among both archetypes. Then your opponent cannot target this card for attacks, which is pretty cool, and this card can attack your opponent directly, so that's pretty nice, right? Your opponent can't select these cards for attacks, although admittedly many of them have very high stats, so I don't know if that really matters. And then also it can hit your opponent directly even if they have a full board. That is kind of neat in theory, although these cards don't have crazy high amount of attacks, so they're not going to usually one-shot your opponent, but it is kind of neat that you can hit them directly even if they have a bunch of monsters, kind of similar to the Toon monsters when you have Toon World on the field. One of the problems with cards like Malefics and cards like Earthbound Immortals is that even if you manage to get them on the field, your opponent doesn't actually need to deal with them, they just need to deal with the field spell. If they just have an MST or a Twin Twisters, not only do you lose your field spell, but you also lose your gigantic monster. One of the biggest differences between the Malefic monsters and the Earthbound Immortals though is that the Malefics are special summons, so while it does suck when your opponent kills the field spell and you lose the Malefic monster, it's not the worst thing in the world. However, in the case of the Earthbound Immortals, while you can special summon, that's completely fine. In a lot of scenarios, I see people building decks where they're tribute summoning them, so then you're losing 2 monsters in the process, and then if your opponent MSTs your field spell, you're not only losing the field spell, you're not only losing the Earthbound Immortal, but you're also losing those 2 tributes that you used to bring out the Earthbound Immortal in the first place. But I think when we're really breaking these cards down, yes, the fact that they're fragile definitely hurts them in terms of competitiveness, but I think the other issue, the bigger issue, is that their individual effects just aren't very good. Even by 2009 standards, many of these effects just don't really matter, or if they are halfway decent, they're not decent enough to offset the inherent downsides of playing these Earthbound Immortal cards. Yes, they're fragile, yes, they have to be tribute summoned, but if they had crazy effects on top of that, maybe they'd be worth playing. However, because they have those restrictions, and because the effects aren't anything to write home about, they just don't make for very competitive cards. So what were some of the earlier ways that people were trying to take advantage of the Earthbound Immortals? Well, I think the most common one, I think this is pretty common for a lot of these old school tribute monsters, was Mausoleum of the Emperor. Mausoleum of the Emperor lets you trade 1,000 life points instead of tributing monsters. So in the case of like an Earthbound Immortal, you trade 2,000 life points, and in theory, I guess that's kind of cool. You get a big monster out, but the problem there is what I said earlier, in that your opponent can just kill the Mausoleum after you summon the Earthbound Immortal, and suddenly you've lost 2,000 life points and your field spell and that Earthbound Immortal, which is a pretty big deal. And in fact, one of the other issues is that when you're using a card like Mausoleum of the Emperor to summon Earthbound Immortals, now you have to compare the power level of the Earthbound Immortals to every other level 7 or level 8 monster in the entire game, because you could be using those monsters instead of them with Mausoleum. For example, there are some pretty deadly level 8 monsters like Vanity's Ruler or even Dark Magician of Chaos pre-errata that you probably would rather summon with Mausoleum instead of the Earthbound Immortals because they have much more impactful effects. And then yes, of course, you can use Mound of the Bound Crater, but I actually made an entire video about why that usually doesn't help decks like these, because the biggest problem is that while Mound of the Bound Crater is cool to have on the field when you finally get those big monsters out, it doesn't actually help you get them out in the first place. And sure, you could play it alongside the Earthbound Immortals with some special summoning power, but if we look at competitively viable strategies, they don't really do that sort of thing. That's a ton of setup just to get a big monster on the board that doesn't have a great effect, and certainly that's kind of cool if you wanted to play Earthbound Immortals casually, but that's not really what this video is about. We're only looking at competitively viable strategies, and unfortunately, Mound of the Bound Crater, as good as it is in some cases, wasn't actually good enough to make the Earthbound Immortals even that much better than they were when they were first released. In fact, there are so many other cards out there, even casually speaking, that Mound of the Bound Crater is better with, that there really isn't a huge reason to even play the Earthbound Immortals with that card unless you just really like the Earthbound Immortals. In fact, the only Earthbound Immortal card that saw any competitive experimentation wasn't even played to be summoned, it was played to be destroyed. So the big reptile one, the big lizard guy, his effect says if this card is destroyed by a card effect except by its own effect, destroy all cards on the field. Now this card wasn't super competitively viable, but it does have a few tops under its belt in a Fire King strategy. So the Fire King deck actually has multiple cards that let you destroy cards in your hand or on your side of the field, like Fire King Avatar Yaksha, so you can actually blow this card up right from your hand. Was that the most common thing to play in Fire Kings? Absolutely not, but it did see some experimentation. It did top a few events, a few regional qualifiers, and that is enough for me to mention it in this video. Other than that though, no Earthbound Immortal card actually saw any competitive play or even experimentation. And just for the record, if we are looking at these cards from which one has the best effect when it actually hits the board, I think that Uru, the big spider monster, by far has the best on-field effect. So this one says once per turn you contribute one other monster, then target one face-up monster your opponent controls, take control of that target until the end phase. And of course, you probably won't give that card back to your opponent. You can use it for a Synchro Summon or an Xyz Summon or a Link Summon or whatever. I think that this one, compared to all the other ones, actually has the most viable effect when it hits the board, although as I just said, these cards weren't really played very much, and the one that was played didn't even hit the field at all. However, there actually is one Earthbound Immortal support card, technically, that saw tons of competitive play, although I do want to mention it didn't see play because of anything to do with Earthbound Immortals. 100 Eyes Dragon was a staple extra deck monster, sometimes a 2 of, sometimes a 3 of, and many Infernity strategies, although like I said, it didn't have anything to do with the Earthbound Immortal part, it was just used because of its effect copying ability. However, this card technically is sort of Earthbound Immortal support, so this card is worth mentioning in this video, even though it wasn't played because of the Earthbound Immortal interaction. And then you awkwardly have cards like Earthbound Wave or Earthbound Whirlwind, that these cards on paper look pretty decent if you haven't realized what the Earthbound Immortal cards are. If these cards were in another archetype, a better archetype, they might actually be playable, but because they're stuck in a deck full of clunky level 10 monsters that blow up if you don't have a field spell, they're not very competitive. Offering to the Immortals and Earthbound Limewalker are so hilariously bad, I can't believe these cards are even printed. They both clearly need like one extra effect to be competitively viable even in 2009, and I think that Earthbound Limewalker is really funny in particular because this card just doesn't do anything, right? You shouldn't have to summon a level 4 monster on top of also summoning the Earthbound Immortal and having the field spell out. Clearly the idea behind Earthbound Limewalker is that you summon it first and then bring out an Earthbound Immortal, but I think in general it's just not very viable because your opponent can simply run over the Limewalker in battle. It only has 1200 attack and 1900 defense. It's not that hard to remove from a field, and then just like in the case of MST versus your field spell, the Earthbound Immortal will now just blow up because you no longer have the Linewalker on the field. Sure, you could counter that and say, well, what if I have a field spell on the field and the Linewalker, but then realize how much you're investing just to get out a 3000 attack beater. And remember, when you're trying to get into competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Analysis, you're not just thinking about if a card is sometimes good or if a card is technically playable. That card has to go up against the other thousands upon thousands of cards out there, and in the case of the Earthbound Immortals, they have a lot of competition even in the tribute summoning mechanic. When you look at some of the most recent tribute summon decks that actually were competitively viable, Monarchs and True Dracos, you really get an idea of how far Konami has to go when printing tribute summoning cards to make them competitively viable. All of those cards have like 3 different effects that are all very powerful, so in comparison the Earthbound Immortals just aren't very good at all. Even if they have some neat interactions with things like Fire Kings, even that wasn't consistent enough for Fire Kings to actually play that in their most common builds. Obviously, if you just want to play them because you like the cards, that's perfectly fine, but we can't really sit here and pretend that these cards were competitively viable when they've been out for 10 years and haven't proven themselves at really any tournaments. Sure, that one Reptile Earthbound Immortal got a few tops, but overall the archetype has pretty much completely flopped. But wait, what about Earthbound Super Priest? What about Earthbound Geoglyph? These cards are coming out at the end of next month. Well, as is the case for many other pieces of legacy support over the past couple years, these cards will make for some pretty entertaining Yu-Gi-Oh! Pro replays under the most ideal of situations. In general, they're just not going to be enough to make the Earthbound Immortal cards competitive. We've seen time and time again some really good pieces of legacy support come out, and they definitely help boost the consistency and power level of older decks, but a lot of times they're just not enough to offset the initial issues with the original cards, and that is definitely the case with these Earthbound Immortal support cards. Anyway though, I think that's all I have to say about the Earthbound Immortals. Let me know what you think about the Earthbound Immortals in the comment section below. I like these cards a lot in terms of their looks and in terms of how they were in the anime, but as far as the competitive TCG goes, these cards just weren't very strong. I'll see you later though. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Goodbye.